My name's Dr. Tom Byrd. I'm an internal medicine doctor, hospital medicine doctor in Brownwood, Texas. I'm a director of hospital medicine there. And what we're going to talk about today is Missions 101 Tips for Volunteering Abroad. How many of you have ever been to this conference before? Very good, very good. How many of you have ever been on a mission trip abroad, short-term or long-term? Okay. How many would like to go at some point? I guess that's inherent. You wouldn't be here otherwise, right? Okay. A little full disclosure about myself. I am not a professional missionary. I've never been on a long-term, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year mission. I'm a habitual short-term missionary in the same country over and over again. I work with a group called the Cries of a Child. They've been on the ground 10 years in the country that we deal with. Their founders, Isaiah and Samantha Torres, amazing people. They've been there the entire time. Started the organization as sort of gospel outreach, church planning. Then they started orphanages. Now, not as you think of in the traditional huge warehousing type setting. They're really group family homes, 6 to 8 kids with a house mother, usually who's a widow. We're up to 34 kids now. Also, when we started, they started a Bible teaching college, a trade school, a social program. And then I became involved about 4 years ago to help set up a medical clinic. It's called the Cornerstone Medical Clinic. I had a background in this in the same country, and we got together through reasons that are very much a God thing. And we opened the clinic 22 months ago, and we've seen 28,000 people. So I'll let you do the math on that. This is Dr. Viator. He's an amazing Christian man, great doctor, and very blessed to have him. So what we're going to do is talk about this country to start with, not because of the organization, but to give you background on when you go somewhere, your impediments are cultural, okay? And you heard some of that from our last speaker. The country we deal with is Burundi. Burundi is in East Central Africa. It's about the size of Maryland. It's landlocked, absolutely beautiful. It looks like Hawaii. It's 2 degrees off the equator, but very mountainous, and so great temperate climate. But it's pretty messy. To the west, from a neighbor standpoint, is Lake Tanganyika and the very messy eastern portion of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. To the east and south is all Tanzania. And to the north is Rwanda, a neighbor that they hold a lot of similarities with, both ethnically and historically. They're made up of the Bantu people. There's 3 tribes. The Tutsis that make up about 15% of the population, probably less than that in the last 4 years. The Hutu, which make up about 85%, and the Twa, or Batwa, which are pejoratively called pygmies. They make up about 2 to 3% of the population. They're very discriminated against. They even think of themselves as the lowest of the low. If you went into a restaurant and they were there, they would leave. Or they'd be shamed and go sit in the corner. The average Burundian male lives to be about 48. Average Burundian female, about 52. If you're a Twa, you live to be about 27. Okay. It's a male-dominated society. There's a lot of gender violence and with a lot of impunity. There's very few arrests for men beating their wives. The background, like most of Africa, is colonial. The Germans colonized Burundi in the late 1800s. The Belgians came in 1942. They've been independent since 1962, but really since then, they've had just a complete series of civil wars. Insert the word genocide on 2 different occasions. The first in 72 and then the last in 93. In 1993, they shared the genocide with their neighbor to the north, Rwanda. In that year, in one particular day, the president of both countries was in Kigali. Their plane was shot down. Many people feel very contrived by one rebel group, and the genocide unleashed in both countries. In Rwanda, the genocide lasted 100 days, and 800,000 people were killed, mostly by primitive tools, machete, and clubs. It was made very famous by a movie called Hotel Rwanda that won the Academy Award, I believe. Fantastic movie, a little bit fictionalized, but fantastic movie. The Burundians kind of speak in allegories, and they'll say that Rwanda sneezed and Burundi caught the cold because the civil war, genocide, in Burundi lasted 10 years. Now, the statistics are really messy. If you get on Wikipedia and things like that, it'll say 210,000, 250,000. I have friends with UN and aid organizations that says probably 600,000 people. Statistics are hard to come by in that part of the world, but it's left at a wreck, okay? The language is Kirundi. It's a Bantu language. It's spoken by about 14 million people in the world. That's about it. French is the official language. You won't hear much English at all. It's very much an agrarian society. 80% of the population outside of the capital of Bujumbura farm, and they're subsistence farmers. 90% of them farm without a plow or without a tractor. It's very deforested, so agricultural techniques are very primitive. Education's a huge issue. The government's broke, and so primary school is all that's paid for. Primary school goes through 6th grade. Okay? After that, you have to pay to go to school, and you have to take a test. But even then, many people leave their kids at home to farm or go fetch water. Okay? Infrastructure is a big problem. Outside of the capital, water and electricity is sketchy. Internet's hard to find anyway. And even in the capital, there's rolling blackouts. It's the poorest country in the world. They go back and forth with they in Malawi a lot, South Sudan. 80% of the people live below the international poverty level of $1.25 American. The average Burundian lives on less than $300 a year. These are Twa, or Batwa, pygmies. 1 in 5 children die before age 5. It's mostly waterborne illnesses and malaria. Maternal mortality rate's 5th highest in the world. There's a physician for every 34,000, less than about 35,000 people in Burundi. In Harris County, it's 385. So it's terribly medically underserved. 4 years ago, the president named Pierre Nkurunziza ran for what he believes is a constitutionally allowed 3rd term. This guy doesn't think so, and neither do a lot of other people, so there was a coup attempt. And since then, probably 600,000 people have fled the country as refugees into Rwanda and Tanzania. So, we'll stop here. This is an extreme example, but these are challenges that everybody faces when you do volunteerism, especially medical volunteerism in the 3rd world. So just kind of low stress audience participation. What kind of challenges trying to go to a culture like this do you have to set up a program? Lots, right? Yeah. So I just literally typed these. Didn't even really think of it. You have historical challenges. Colonialism and genocide. You know, if you're over 20-something years old, this is very fresh. Everybody in this country has been affected by it, and so sometimes you go to set up a project and they'll kind of think, thanks, but where were you guys in 93, you know? Language, how many of y'all are fluent in Kirundi? How many of you can speak French without a translator? Okay, so you got to get a translator, right? Corruption. This is ubiquitous in the 3rd world. I mean, there's very, very few examples where there's a 3rd world country that there's not government corruption. So as a Christian, what do you think about paying a bribe to get a machine bought? Because you have to have a permit. So that comes into play, right? Infrastructure. Like I said, it's a mess. Tribalism. So this isn't as big a deal, interestingly. This is more party affiliation now, but still, there's undercurrents, and sometimes the leaders fan this. So what about your patients sitting in the same room? What about your employees? What about the people working in the clinic that you're trying to support? Do they get along? Are there issues there? Education issues, same thing. It's difficult in our country. I've practiced 22 years. It's difficult among the uneducated or undereducated to get them to understand disease concepts, okay? There it's even worse, and we're going to talk about that a great deal. And even your employees. I mean, people who clean, people who do menial jobs, it's very difficult sometimes to get them to do things. Transportation. In global health, there's this phenomenon called the last mile. And it's very true. If you can go to the capital of almost any developing country or undeveloped country, And there's transportation. You can get aid to people there. But the further you go, the concrete turns to dirt that turns to path. And that's where the people need it. How do you get there? You know, is there infrastructure to get them out there? And the last is extreme poverty and malnutrition. There's a guy named Josh Ruxin. If you ever get a chance to read the book, it's called 1,000 Hills to Heaven. And hopefully the guy will win the Nobel Prize someday. I was lucky to meet him in Rwanda. All his work is in Rwanda, and he has this sort of Ruxin's 6 rules or something. But number 1 is hungry people can't think. You've got to feed them first before you try and do anything else. Okay, so what we'll do, you can see from here that when you're going to volunteer abroad, all of your challenges are cultural, for the most part, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna explore those cultural challenges one at a time. We're gonna talk about culture shock, reverse culture shock, ethnocentrism, language barriers, issues with time, which is pretty fascinating, social etiquette, and very quickly we'll talk about cultural beliefs about service. I promise we're not going to do too many nerdy Sociology 101 slides, but here's 2 of them, okay? To talk about those factors, you have to really understand what culture is. And there's a million models. I like this one. This was set up by a guy named Paul Kwast, K-W-A-S-T. He calls it the man from Mars approach to understand culture. He says there's 4 layers. The first is behavior, customs, products, languages. It's essentially what is done in our society, in our culture. The next one is values, and a lot of behavior is dictated by values. It answers questions, what is good, what is best, what's needed. Then beliefs, what is true. But at the heart of any culture is worldview, and that answers the question, in our culture, what is real? Who are we? Where do we come from? Or maybe, what do we think about dreams or visions? Spirits. Who bears the full weight of honor and shame in a culture? Is it a woman? Is it a man? Or is it even an individual? Is it a family? Is it a tribe? Is it a community? Paul Hebert, this is a great quote. He is the missionary's missionary. He was born to mission parents in India, spent his entire life either on mission or teaching missions, has a PhD. I think he's one of the foremost cultural anthropologists, certainly foremost Christian cultural anthropologists ever. He has this great quote. He says, when we enter new cultures, we become keenly aware of the fact that people live differently. At first, we see these differences in dress, food, language, behavior. And then we learn that there are profound differences in beliefs, feelings, and values. And finally, we begin to realize there's fundamental differences in worldview. People in different cultures don't live in the same world with different labels, but radically different worlds. So last nerdy slide. Think of our worldview versus that of the developing world. We are very egocentric. I mean, it's all about us. And that's kind of selfish, but really, I mean, it is. It's about us. Especially in our society. Man, we are all about, we are all about independence and individual rights. In the bulk of the developing world, it's very sociocentric. They're into belonging and family security and harmony. The other thing that is really kind of grabs you when you're there is our worldview. Status is earned here for the most part. I mean, there's nepotism, don't get me wrong. But look, I'm a public school kid who's 2 generations away from overalls, and I became a doctor. You don't find that commonly in the developing world, and that creates class differences that you have to deal with while you're there. So let's jump into the first thing. That's culture shock. This is a very real phenomena, and I have a better appreciation for it because I've been on both sides of this. I've been to Burundi a gazillion times, but also almost a year ago, 13 months ago, my wife and I brought in and hosted for quite a while a couple from Burundi who were very persecuted refugees. The wife was 7 months pregnant, malnourished, and had malaria when we picked her up at the airport, and they had one little bag. So here they are a year later. They both have jobs. Their baby was born. And part of this, we live in a small town with some connections, but still, it's been an arduous journey for them. They are so much better off, but they're living in a different world. So I've seen this on both ends. Webster's defines culture shock as a sense of confusion and uncertainty, sometimes with feelings of anxiety that may affect people exposed to an alien culture or environment without adequate preparation. Now, you can get this a little bit even in our society if you think about it. Let's say you're a rancher in rural West Texas and someone teleports you to Queens or San Francisco. There's going to be some anxiety, some angst, or vice versa, right? So you grew up in Manhattan, you went to prep school, you go to Columbia, you're a Wall Street banker, and you kind of fly all over the place, and somebody dumps you in eastern Oklahoma. Okay, well, same language, same values, kinda, but there's some anxiety. But this pales in comparison to what you get, the emotional roller coaster that you get to going to the developing world. Lots of models. I kind of simplified this. What makes up culture shock? Well, first of all, when you go somewhere, there's a honeymoon phenomena. You're glad to be there. Look at this. This is amazing. I'm finally here. And then very quickly, as the last speaker told you, it's one thing to see a picture of a starving child. It's another thing to be in the room with them. So you get this feeling of overwhelming sadness, just suffocating poverty. And it invariably leads to this comparative analysis of where you are in the world to where they are in the world. It was Bono's quote, something along the lines of a quirk of latitude and longitude may determine whether you starve to death or not. And then so all at once, there becomes this guilt. It may be displaced, I don't know, but I'm an American, and these are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're dying, you know, so that adds to this. The next one's called the Mzungu factor. Now, Mzungu is a Swahili word that literally translates to white person, but over the last decade or so, it's just been morphed into Westerner, okay? So if you're from the West, you go down the street, they're gonna call you a Mzungu, and they can tell. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're black or not, you know, you're a first world person. And with that comes the expectation that you would expect. I mean, you're there to do clinic work or church planning or agriculture or whatever. Yeah, they expect you to help with that. But it gets deeper than that. Because you're an American especially, you've got money and education and money and sophistication and money and superiority. You're rich. And it doesn't matter if you're a student up to here in student debt and you've worked your way through everything and you did a GoFundMe page to get there, you're rich. And they're kind of right, but it grates on you a little bit because I've been to Burundi multiple times, and the last time, in fact, I'm going back in 6 weeks, the last time is the only time I've literally not had someone come up to me and ask me to get them to America, and sometimes with their family, because then they'll be out of poverty. And then there's other little things. They want you to take their picture. They want to carry your bags, not knowing that they expect money for that. And you can kind of feel taken advantage of, but they're just trying to survive, right? You're going to pay higher prices at markets. The most expensive bananas I've ever bought, relatively, where I'm going to this market in Gitega. It's a little village in the center of the country. And I'm using my French, which is kind of get the ball over the net French. It's not very good, with a Texas accent. And then my 40 Kirundi words. Very proud of them. I go back to the clinic. Some of the locals ask how much I paid for it. They start giggling, and they said, you got Mzungu'd, you know. So, again, after a while, you can feel a little taken advantage of. And then the last thing is futility. And that's both emotional and physical futility. After you've been there a while, you start being sad, can this problem ever be fixed? And then you retreat. You know, you start hanging around Westerners, eating Western food, hoping to get a score, you know, the Rockets game or something, and you just kind of disappear from them. But there's some tips. The biggest thing, you wouldn't be at this lecture if you didn't believe in the power of prayer. There is a peace, as we all know. Pray up front, pray while you're there, you know, pray for clarity and judgment and wisdom. The other thing is don't judge populations by individuals. I think if we, you know, it's dinner time, we all walk across the street and some knucklehead cuts us off in traffic and starts cursing at us, and, you know, well, we're not going to judge all Houstonians or all Texans or all Americans by this guy. The bulk of the population is very glad you're there. They appreciate you being there, so don't do that. Prepare up front. I mean, there's no reason in this day and age with these things, you know, you've got all the information on the planet. It won't make you culturally competent, but at least you can know what you're getting into before you go. And travel with humility and humor. And again, embrace the difference. This is me. It's not every day. You can be on a nice carbon frame bike, kind of tooling through rural Africa and get passed by a guy with 100 pounds of bananas, barefoot on a 1950 era Belgian bicycle with no brakes. I mean, how can you not like that? So just embrace everything that happens to you. One of my favorite Psalm quotes, weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Remember that what you're going through is very temporary and very expected, and that poverty was there long before you got there. But your steps, small steps, lead to great changes. We're going to talk about reverse culture shock. I don't have a specific slide for it. To me, interestingly, I was never bothered as much by culture shock, and some of it, I'm 58, I started doing this in my 40s. So I was a little more worldly, a little more mature. I have a horrible problem to this day with reverse culture shock. And that's essentially, I don't have a specific definition. It's the way you feel about your native culture when you return. I can't stand buffet lines anymore. Okay, 32 to 36% of the world's food is either destroyed or not eaten before it gets to the target. I don't like seeing people wasting water. And I can be really self-righteous and sanctimonious. My wife finally told me to shut up the first time I went. If someone says, I'm starving, I say, no, you're not. You're hungry. You're hungry. You're not starving. Or one of the nurses, she was telling me, gosh, this has been such a tough day. It's been such a long day. And I said, wow, yeah, do you have internet? And what are all these? Oh, lights. You have lights and running water. And it's my problem, not hers, you know what I mean? But it's a very common thing. There's a guy named, he'll be one of the speakers, David Jacket. He runs the Texas Director for Perspectives, which is a fantastic class about, kind of spreading the gospel. But he talks about the first time he went on mission, like 20 years ago, he was in Guatemala or somewhere. And he came back, he was just on fire. And his mom picks him up at the airport in Dallas at DFW. And before he could really say anything, she said, David, I'm sorry, I'm 10 minutes later. You can't believe the traffic problem. That since you've been gone, there's traffic jams constantly. And he said he was just crushed because he thought, well, 36 hours ago, we buried an orphan. And if we just had a car, he said it took a lot of grace and humility, to kind of get over that. So a real thing. Okay, well, let's talk about topic number 3 is ethnocentrism. That's the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture. So in other words, the way we do things is normal. The way they do things is peculiar or odd. You take that thought process down a little bit more. The way we do things is right. The way they do things is wrong. And that can quickly lead to a lack of respect, both ways. And just from a practical standpoint, you won't accomplish what you want to do if this comes into play very often. So look, we're interested in medicine, right? That's why we're at this conference. So how do we look at disease? Okay, well, it's kind of this combination, I think you'd think, kind of an amalgamation of genetics and lifestyle and twist of fate and whatever. So for instance, if you're a woman in this room, you've got a 1 in 6 chance of getting breast cancer, right? If you've got a first-degree relative, if it's your mom or sister, it goes to 1 in 6. If you're a man, your prostate cancer statistics are pretty close to that, okay? What if you're diabetic? We know if your hemoglobin A1C is greater than 7, which is a blood sugar roughly average 148 to 152, then there's a linear slope of you developing the ravages of diabetes, right? Accelerated atherosclerosis, nephropathy, retinopathy, neuropathy. What about lifestyle? What if you smoke? Okay, what puts you at risk for emphysema, for heart disease? So you get it. I mean, that's kind of how we understand disease. If you're in the developing world, you may be sick because of something you thought about somebody, or the fact that your grandfather cheated somebody on some land generations ago. Some ancestral, retribution has come back to you, or somebody put a spell on you, a witch doctor. Don't minimize that. This is very real in the bulk of the developing world. So how do you deal with that? Well, let me give you an example. And I think this was in Mali. It may have been in Ghana, and I can get you the paper if you want to. But anyway, there was a group that was going to set up a TB eradication program. And it was a beautiful design. They kind of elicited the help of a lot of local health volunteers who were bilingual. And they went out into the villages. got their target group, tested them, gave them the appropriate medication. And then at the follow-up at 3 or 4 months, it wasn't very good. It really wasn't very good at all. And they suspected it was non-compliance, but they didn't know why. So again, the community health volunteers go back into the community, and as it turns out, what happened, the reason they weren't taking the medicine is that the local, folk healer, witch doctors type told them not to do it, but to take some herbs, and gave them particular herbs, and to boil it and drink the soup, okay? What a great time to be ethnocentric. I mean, I practice in a county that has about a 22% poverty level, and it's everything I can do, not when I'm not tired, to say, just take the medicine. Just take it. Trust me. I know more. That's what I'm thinking. I never say that. This is a great opportunity for them to disrespect the local culture. But here's what they did. They met with the witch doctors, with all these community health volunteers. They examined the tea, the broth from it, and interestingly enough, it helped cough. Wasn't going to cure tuberculosis, but they kind of worked out a system with the witch doctors and said, look, we feel like that if we use your herbs and our medication, these people will be cured. And what happened? Of course, TB was cured. I mean, it was essentially eradicated in that portion of the country. So that's just an example, but you have to be very careful in everything you do not to disrespect their culture. Okay, I'm sorry, my inherent inclination to talk too much, we're kind of getting behind. So, concepts of time. I call it elastic time. Time is treated very differently in the developing world, and it's going to be one of the very first things you notice. In fact, the Peace Corps back in the 70s or 80s came up with 2 definitions of time. There's monochronic time. Time is a given and people are the variable. The needs of the people are adjusted to suit the demands of time, such as schedules and deadlines. It's quantifiable and there's a limited amount of it, and people can do one thing at a time before finishing it and beginning something else. Well, we're living it right now, right? I mean, my lecture started at this time, and I've got X amount of minutes, and you knew that you had to be here kind of at the same time, or otherwise, if you walked in too late, people would look at you, and I'm going to get a red light that tells me I'm running late. And then tomorrow morning, right, you're going to set your alarm for 5:30 or 7 or 8 or whatever it is, so you can work out or read or study, because you've got to be to work. We function pretty well with that. Then there's polychronic time. Time is a servant tool of the people, and it's adjusted to suit the needs of the people. More time is always available, and you're never too busy. It's not necessary to finish your business with one person before starting with another. Okay? So let's have some very low-stress audience participation. What's your name? Gloria. Gloria owns some land, let's say about 2 hours walk from my village. It's up in the mountains, okay? And we're going to meet tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And we're going to talk about me planting some cassava on her land, and we can work out a deal where she makes a little money and I do. It's going to be perfect. 2 hour walk. We're going to meet at 1 o'clock. Okay. What's your name? Ramsey. Okay. Ramsey owns the biggest fruit stand at the market. Okay. And so I start walking up to Gloria's, but I don't leave at 11. I leave at 11:30. Okay. I'm running a little late. And I run into Ramsey, and she says, hey, I noticed your wife has the basket, it's broken. Her fruit, she can't hold as much. And I said, yeah, she told me that. And she said, if you come over now, the person next door to me, my neighbor, makes baskets. That's pretty cool. So we go, I meet with her, and we drink a glass of tea and talk about the political situation and what's going on. It's just terrible, and have another glass of tea. And finally, about 30 minutes later, we come over to Gloria's, and she said, yes, I can make you a basket. And so one thing leads to another, and we barter, and finally I buy it and start walking, and now it's 20-1, okay? So I take my time, I get up there, and I arrive now 45 minutes or an hour late, and there's Gloria on the porch, okay? And she's talking to somebody with a suit. So I said, okay. So I do my thing a little bit, and finally she comes down, and now we're an hour and a half late, and we start talking, and that's okay with everybody. Now, as a Westerner, that will drive you nuts. I mean, it really will. But that's the way it goes. Now, along those same lines is the concept of pace of life and waiting. Okay, our clinic starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, roughly. At about 7:30, we have kind of a testimonial and a Bible study with people who are in the waiting room and with our staff. And then a little bit before 8, there's a kind of preventative health lecture, how to boil water, hygiene, things like that. And then we start seeing people at 8 o'clock. And by that time, there may be 60 people in the waiting room ready to be seen. And guess what? They're not playing words with friends. They're not sending Snapchats to everybody. And they're not on Instagram. They're sitting and waiting, okay? So while they're doing that, you're the new volunteer. So whoever runs the clinic sends you down the road to the minister of fill in the blank to pick up the paper that gives us permission to buy something, okay? So you go, and being a good American, you get there at 5 till 1 because you're supposed to be there at 1 o'clock. And as soon as you enter the room's full of other people waiting. Again, they're not doing Snapchat. They're just waiting. And you look at the secretary, and she acknowledges you. And you say, "I'm here to pick up the form." She goes, "Oh, the minister's very busy." So you wait, and you start getting anxious because you don't know what to do with your hands. And I'm just waiting. I don't have a book to read. There's no TV. So finally, about 20 minutes later, she looks out the window and says, "I'm sorry, the minister's very detained, and you'll have to come back another day." Well, the minister's the guy in the suit with Gloria up there, okay? And again, it can be very frustrating. And in our culture, we think making someone wait and being tardy is rude. But there, it is very much just a sign and symptom of a culture with different concepts of time that's very relaxed. So don't be insulted, but prepare for it. It's going to happen. This is a great quote from a Peace Corps volunteer that was in Fiji. "When I first traveled out to my island via cargo ship, I was told to report at 4 p.m. on Tuesday. We left late in the day on Thursday. Welcome to a tiny island in the South Pacific." All right, let's go on and talk a little bit about language barriers. This is a kid, he's a young man now. His name is Igor Giraniza. The very first time I went to Burundi a number of years ago, he was a student in university. I think he was a first-year student. Now he's an equivalent of a fourth-year medical student in Rwanda. I learned a lot about dealing with language from working with Igor. Igor is fluent in Swahili, Kirundi. His French is absolutely perfect. And he taught himself English and some German by watching YouTube videos. I mean, just brilliant mind, brilliant mind. But I learned a lot from him. And some of the things were, I've kind of delineated a lot of this out. Speak more slowly than usual and use simple language, okay? Now, if I had walked in earlier today and I said, "Morning, how y'all doing?" You don't have to be a Texan. I dropped the G. I didn't say good morning. And y'all, what's a y'all? But that sort of translates to all of us. Good morning, how is everyone doing? Igor doesn't hear that, okay? So try and speak the Queen's language and use very short sentences. Speak 2 or 3 at a time, pause and allow the translator to translate. Avoid long conversations with the interpreter. If you're not making eye contact with your local, with your patient, and you're only talking to the interpreter, put yourself in that position. It makes you feel very uneasy. Are they talking about me? Are they insulting me? So really try and avoid long conversations with the interpreter. And as silly as it sounds, don't laugh. I mean, you could... We got into a thing one time where Igor kind of giggled because he didn't know how to translate pleurisy. It's a tough word in Kirundi. Well, I worried about the poor lady thinking, well, is she making fun of me? So we kind of had to explain that to her. The other one is maintain your role as the interviewer. After several sessions, your interpreter may notice a pattern to your questions and ask what they think your next question will be. This was something very common that after day 1, I had to talk to Igor about. Literally the first day I used him, about 60% of what we saw were waterborne illnesses, just terrible diarrhea, cramps and all that. And so, the line of questioning would go, what brings you here today? Well, I'm having stomach cramps and terrible diarrhea. Where do you get your water? Well, I get it from the stream. Do you boil your water? Well, I'd like to, but sometimes we don't have wood to boil the water. So we would go through this, and literally about the 4th question, I would ask, what brings you here today? And they would talk back and forth, and Igor would look at me, she needs the blue pills like the last person. And so you really have to slow them down and make sure that you're driving the conversation. And then lastly, treat your interpreter with respect, which goes without saying. Protocols for interacting with the locals. Obviously, always introduce yourself and the interpreter. And as I said before, maintain eye contact with the person you're talking to. Don't converse with the interpreter. Talk to them. The other thing is pay attention to nonverbal cues. You don't have to speak the language often to know when someone's in pain, when someone's depressed, when someone's stressed. I mean, we get that in English, and so pay attention to nonverbal cues. Probably the most important thing is try and learn basic phrases and greetings. If you can learn to say good morning, good evening, hello, goodbye, thank you, God bless you. If you can do that, it really ingratiates you to the population. And then obviously have them repeat back what you're telling them, because first of all, it'll make them know that you're engaged, but also it's very important with instructions. Social etiquette. This is mostly things to look up before you go, but I'll give you some hints. I mean, always look up standard of dress, greetings, eating customs, photographs, and gestures. In general, standards of dress conservatively. If you're a man, wear a collared shirt, tuck it in, wear long pants, and wear closed-toed shoes. If you're a woman, cover your shoulders, cover your legs. That's pretty standard, but look it up anywhere you go. Greetings, same sort of thing. In our country, especially in the business world, I think you'd agree a firm handshake with eye contact is appropriate. In a lot of cultures, a really firm handshake can be a sign of aggression. And eye contact, especially between genders, sometimes can appear flirtatious. So again, just look it up before you go. Now, I've got a friend that does some mission work in another country in Africa, and apparently he told me that, a very boisterous handshake means you're more friendly. I mean, I want to get to know you kind of thing. Eating customs. Some places you're expected to clean your plate. Other places, if you clean your plate, that means you want more food. Oftentimes you're going to be admired and looked at as an honorary member of their house for the day, and so you'll get the best food. The last time I was in Burundi, my wife went with me, and we were touring another clinic that a friend of ours had opened up, and with a number of people, and they prepared sort of the standard Burundian fare, rice and wonderful vegetables and this fresh fruits and avocados. But there was this sort of creepy piece of meat, and I made an A in anatomy. I'm not exactly sure what it was, and I'm kind of a closet vegetarian anyway, so I kind of picked around it. And our friend Freddie kind of leaned over to both of us and says, chicken is very expensive here, and please do the honor of eating that. And so I hid as much of it as I could under the rice, but again, know that up front before you go. If you don't remember anything else on this portion, on photographs, ask permission to take pictures of kids, okay? Now, I know, we see this all the time in magazines, the image of a kid with tattered clothes that's malnourished is extraordinarily powerful. It's not that you mean to take advantage of that, but if you convey that message back to the people who sent you and people, your friends, they get some of that feeling too, and they send more money in prayer, and it helps that kid, at least in your mind, you think that. But let's play it the other way. Let's say you're walking down the street here with your child or nephew or a friend's kid, and all at once, people from another culture, they kind of swarm around with a camera, and they kind of move you out of the way and start taking the picture. Well, how are you going to react to that? If you're in a really bad mood, you may smack the camera out of their hand or call CPS or the police. But that's not appropriate. So why would it be okay for us to do that? Okay, so always get permission to take a picture. And we did. We got permission to take these kids' picture. Gestures. I don't know if anybody's ever been to rural Turkey, but I've been told that if you do the okay sign, that's like extending the middle finger to somebody here. So don't just do things without knowing it. I know in Burundi, and I learned this the very first trip, when I went like this to little kids, they started flocking to me. That means come here. So again, kind of look those things up before you go. Great picture. We got permission to take this. from Thessalonians, as for you brothers, do not grow weary in doing good. Really quickly, I think we're running a little bit behind. Cultural beliefs about service. I think we'd all agree that in our culture, if you're one of the haves, you're admired for giving back. I mean, I think, we think of Bill Gates or Michael Dell or Bono or, fill in the blank, Warren Buffett. We admire the fact that they're trying to make a difference with their own treasure, okay? And in other cultures, it's a little tricky sometimes because in much of the developing world, it's the family that's responsible for taking care of their family members. So it can sometimes, to the recipient, make them wonder if it's dishonoring their family because they're not capable of taking care of them. Again, not there all the time, but something to think about. Notions of pride and shame. In much of the world, especially much of the developing world, the concept of face and pride is very important. Historical context. Again, a lot of missions have come and set up things and then disappeared and left a bunch of old equipment that's not worth anything. So, and again, depending on the culture, again, like I know in Burundi, the genocide is still very real to a lot of those people. And sometimes, again, where were you guys in 1993? And then just the whole concept of collectivism versus individualism. Okay, resources. Most of these, it's like I said, old school, it's on paper. Most of these, well, let's just run through them real quick. There's a couple of blogs. The first one's Alyssa Pfister. She's an amazing pediatrician. You can just kind of read this and toss it out. She's an amazing pediatrician in Burundi. She's been there about 3 or 4 years, and she wrote this blog about a year ago or 6 or 8 months ago about coming back to the States. And then after she finished, she kind of wondered, well, where do I really belong? I mean, she'd truly become kind of bicultural. Ruth Ackers is a good friend of mine. Ruth is a PhD pharmacist from Great Britain who was our pharmacy director and helped us open the clinic. She was there 3 straight years, and she married our lawyer and HR director, Claude. And she wrote a little blog called Claude's Culture Shock. And it was not only the culture shock of the first time he went to the UK with her, but just traveling around Africa, people expected him when they went to Mozambique that, well, you don't speak Portuguese. And so it's kind of an odd thing. I love the picture too. This is their sort of formal, traditional picture in a tea field, and you're never alone in Burundi. There's people out there. 2 books I'd recommend. Transforming Worldviews by Paul Hebert. I mentioned him earlier. It's a little bit academic, a little bit dry, but it's a great book. And I think everybody should read When Helping Hurts. It's on its, I think, 2nd or 3rd printing at this point. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think it will open your eyes. What are we supposed to be doing over there? Okay. The best $100 you can spend. Now, this is a secular group called Unite for Sight. They're kind of an offshoot from the Yale Global Health Initiative. And for $100, you can get a master's certificate, which is essentially 15 hours. You get it all online toward a master's in global health, social sustainability. They've got it in clinic or NGO development, refugee health. So get on their site and check it out. And then probably the most important thing is that last page that just has a bunch of websites and contact people. Those are people throughout the state that if you've decided, look, I want to take a trip and I don't know exactly how to connect with someone, those are all, I think, all very reputable folks. I would tell you, though, the best resource this weekend is this conference. I mean, the number of booths and displays, go to every one of them. Ask them what they do. The last slide is a pep talk. Last year at this conference, the theme was just say yes. Just say yes. One of my favorite Bible verses in Proverbs, a man's heart plans his course, but the Lord commands his steps. This is an amazing guy named Dennis Cochran, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak in our little town at a perspectives course. This picture, I think, was taken in 1964, and that year, he, his wife, and 2 children, the youngest daughter, I think, was 5 weeks old. No kidding. They flew to Papua New Guinea and embedded themselves into the Duna people. Now, his wife was a nurse. Over the course of 12 years, the Duna people only had a spoken language. There was no written language. He developed a written language for them, translated the entire New Testament into their language. So the entire tribe converted to Christianity, and the wife, the nurse, saved hundreds and hundreds of lives and taught basic hygiene, basic health, and really transformed. So he just said, yes, I'm going to go. So these next couple days, listen to people, go to these booths, look things over, pray about it, and just say yes. All right? Well, one thing before we go, this is kind of funny. When I put this slide up here, a man's heart plans his course, but the Lord commands his steps. In our culture, we think our heart, I gave my heart to someone. Okay, that's our soul. In the Duna people, it's their stomach. So I guess a man's stomach plans his course. I didn't know that when I put this. Anyway, thank you all very much. If you have a question, I'll be happy to answer it. If not, just say yes. All right. God bless y'all.